April sunshine, the kind that turns the world green and whispers promises of long summer days, should have been a comfort. But Audrey hunkered on that hospital bench, tears a blur against the new leaves, and felt only the cold seep of dread. No strolls through the park, no lazy afternoons sketching out vacation plans, only the sterile hush of the waiting room and the ache of what might never be. No one around to see her cry, at least. A small sliver of relief amidst the storm. Michael, her rock, the man who seemed invincible. No problem too big, no worry he couldn't soothe with that reassuring grin or a well-timed squeeze of her hand. Now, lying pale and hooked to those damn machines, he still tried to play the strong one. "We'll make it, dear," he'd whispered, hand trembling in hers. He understood her better than she understood herself sometimes. Like their minds ran on the same track, their hearts always in sync. Silly as it sounded, that two halves of a whole cliché held a kernel of truth for them. Audrey swallowed back a sob. Not enough strength left in him for anything other than blind hope. But he knew her, always had, knew the fear and despair she battled beneath her forced smiles. "We'll make it." Wishful thinking, more than anything. Michael only knew his diagnosis in broad strokes. What point in scaring him with the gritty details? No, that burden Audrey kept locked inside. Every whispered consultation with Professor James Clark, their last hope. Her parents pulling every string they could to get Michael under his care. When it all seemed to click, she dared to breathe a sigh of relief. Doctors weren't gods, though. Miracles only happened in storybooks. And with each passing day, Audrey watched the man she loved fade a little more. Once bursting with life, his vibrant green eyes now hollow, that wide smile barely a ghost of what it had been. It was torture, a slow drowning she was powerless to stop. If there was any kind of justice in the world, Michael should have been the last person struck down by an incurable illness. He'd never taken his health for granted, not like most folks. Tall, broad-shouldered, the strongest guy she'd ever met, a force of nature, always on the go. He used to joke about having alien blood somewhere in his ancestry, explaining his near-superhuman energy. Audrey sometimes caught herself picturing it, their kids, inheriting that boundless energy, his thick hair, mischievous smile. It was a dream they held dear. Yet, deep down, the question festered like an open wound. He didn't even know his own family. Just another lonely kid trapped in that ramshackle orphanage. An old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by strangers. It took years of pestering the nannies before one finally relented and told Michael the hard truth. Those were hard years. Not the time for dreams. People were barely scraping by. Babies? A luxury few could afford. So kids like Michael, left on orphanage steps or torn from families in ruin. They were just another burden in a world already stretched too thin. He never talked much about those early days. Just flashes of memory he'd share with a wry smile, the kind that hid a deeper ache. Stories of sharing a single piece of hard candy among a dozen hungry kids, or enduring the scoldings of overworked nannies too exhausted to be truly kind. He never dwelt on it, though. Wasn't in his nature to dwell on the darkness. Michael saw the good in everything, a stray cat finding a scrap of food, a hint of blue in an otherwise stormy sky. But Audrey knew it hadn't been easy, growing up with no one to call your own. And yet, he'd defied expectations. Instead of becoming cold, hard, Michael was the kindest soul Audrey had ever known. It felt like a miracle sometimes, how they'd found each other. An ordinary night out with her girlfriends after grueling exams, a crowded club filled with thumping music and flashing lights. She'd been in her element, flowing dress, a hint of a smile that told the world, "I know my worth." Plenty of guys swarmed around. the slick one, the one awed by her looks, the one trying too hard to seem mysterious. None of them held a candle to the shy, handsome stranger who finally worked up the courage to join her table. Michael. A simple name for an extraordinary man. Worn jeans, a faded gray t-shirt, those sparkling green eyes holding an honesty that caught her off guard. He wasn't playing any games. From the first smile, the way their conversation flowed like a familiar river, it felt right, as if every piece of her finally fit into place. Her friends returned, buzzing with gossip and playful teasing. It didn't faze him a bit. And best of all, unlike every other guy that night, he didn't even spare a glance for Sarah, her sultry friend dripping with expensive jewelry. He saw Audrey, truly saw her. The girls exchanged knowing glances, giggles rippling through the air like cheap champagne bubbles. Typical. But Michael wasn't playing their game. He wasn't even pretending to admire Sarah and her flashy necklace, the one that usually made every guy in the room drool. It made Audrey's head spin, the way he looked at her. Not like some prize to be won, but as if she was the only girl in the world. She wasn't some breathtaking beauty, just Audrey, with her simple dress and shy smile. Yet, in his eyes, well, she felt like the star of her very own fairy tale. A slow song drifted over the speakers, and Michael held out his hand. "May I?" The touch of his calloused palm on hers sent a thrill up her arm. There was a strength in him, not some muscle-bound, show-off kind of strength, but something deeper, steadier. She moved with him onto the dance floor, and for a few blissful minutes, the world faded away. His scent, a mix of clean soap and something woodsy, utterly masculine, filled her senses. She wanted this moment to stretch into forever, to feel his warmth and quiet confidence surrounding her always. She still barely knew this man. Where he came from, what he did. It didn't matter. His soul shone through in his gentle smile, the way he moved with quiet grace. Next to him, Audrey felt protected, cherished, something she hadn't dared dream existed. This was it. This was the reason she'd been waiting. The song faded away too soon. He led her back to the table, his fingers brushing hers. "I need to step out for a bit. A friend needs help. But I'll be back. Wait for me." "Don't be silly," she teased, trying to hide the breathless hope in her voice. Yet, as the evening wore on and Michael remained absent, that hope began to twist into dread. Her friends babbled on about other guys, the music, anything to distract themselves from finals. But none of it mattered to Audrey. Where was he? Worry turned to a dull ache, then a surge of anger hot enough to make her blush. Had she been a fool? Just another conquest for some smooth-talking player? But that didn't make sense either, not with the way Mikhail looked at her. "Someone ditch you, sweetheart?" Christina's voice, heavy with pity, broke into her thoughts. Audrey forced a smile. "No, just a friend of his. He'll be back." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but even if he'd walked out and forgotten her, she couldn't shake the feeling they were meant to be. It was crazy, the connection she felt to someone she'd known for mere hours. "Screw this," Sarah announced, always the first to cut ties with boredom. "Let's hit the Crown. Party's just getting started there." Audrey couldn't muster up the energy to argue. Even as her friends chattered excitedly, all she could do was hope that maybe, somehow, he'd find his way back. The idea of walking away without a word, without a chance to know, it was unbearable. The cab ride was a blur. Stepping out onto the rain-slicked street, Audrey scanned the crowd with a desperate edge. And there, leaning against a lamppost, was Michael. She couldn't believe it. A wave of relief so intense it was almost pain washed over her. "We didn't even get phone numbers," she blurted out, giddy and breathless. "I know," he said, that shy smile spreading across his face. "When you left, it was like getting doused in ice water. Figured I couldn't let the night end without finding you." The girls erupted into squeals, and Audrey, beaming, knew she'd never feel as happy as she did in that rain-soaked moment. No movie could have scripted it better. "So the crown?" Sarah chirped. Or Michael's gaze met Audrey's, and a silent question hung in the air. "Actually," she began, a thrill of defiance mingled with anticipation coursing through her. "How about a walk?" Christina gave her a stern look. "Just text when you're home, okay? Promise?" Audrey nodded. She knew her practical friend was only looking out for her, especially tonight. Still, something about the extra scrutiny tugged on her pride. It wasn't like she couldn't take care of herself, was it? They wandered the rain-washed streets, hands clasped. Conversation flowed as easily as the river cutting through the quiet neighborhood. The world seemed to fade into the background, just the faint rhythm of their synchronized steps on the pavement, and the warmth where their fingers touched. Every so often, their eyes would meet, and an unspoken something hung in the air between them. A streetlight flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced and merged. Laughter died on Audrey's lips as Michael reached out, gently tucking a stray strand of rain-dampened hair behind her ear. His touch, the faint ghost of a callus on his fingertip, sent a tingling shiver down her spine. "I watched you for weeks," he murmured, the words barely audible over the patter of rain on the cobblestones. Heat rushed to her cheeks. Had he really noticed her before that night in the club? The thought stirred a heady mix of excitement and unease. "Couldn't work up the nerve to, well, be a normal guy and walk up to you." His voice held a teasing lilt, but when he met her gaze, any trace of humor vanished. There was a vulnerability there, a flickering spark of hope mingled with an almost fearful hesitation. Her own breath hitched. Suddenly, the city lights didn't seem so bright. Just two people in this quiet bubble, hearts beating a shared rhythm. Every instinct screamed at her to be reckless, to toss aside the rules of waiting and give in to the undeniable tension simmering between them. They stopped beneath a crooked old elm tree, its leaves glistening like emeralds in the hazy glow of the street lamp. Audrey could smell the rain-dampened earth, the sharp tinge of wet leaves, and beneath that, the familiar woodsy scent of Michael himself, grounding and intoxicating all at once. His gaze swept over her face, lingering for a long moment on her lips. Was it just a trick of the flickering light, or had they parted as if in silent invitation? Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the steady whisper of the rain. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. He closed the distance with aching slowness, tilting his head slightly. Every nerve ending hummed, anticipating that first press of lips against hers. Her knees went weak. It was everything she'd imagined, and nothing like it. He took his time, gentle, as if every brush of his lips on hers was sacred, something precious he never expected to find. They talked through the night. Every detail Michael shared about his past pulled on her heartstrings. The orphanage had never been a real home. He never knew his parents, grew up on the outskirts of caring. Audrey found the very idea painful beyond words. How had he made it? Not just survived, but flourished. Turns out those nannies were wrong about Michael. His sharp mind became his lifeline. He studied harder than anyone else, teachers taking pity on the bright boy with no one pushing him along. It sparked a hunger to break the cycle, to create a life no one expected for him, especially Audrey. With her loving parents, her cozy childhood, she'd taken so much for granted. Michael never had that luxury. The prestigious degree, the IT job, his hard-earned apartment. Everything he had, he'd fought for tooth and nail. He moved through the world with a self-reliance that awed her. He had his life planned out, ambitions fueled by the fear of ever slipping back into that childhood insecurity. Yet behind the drive was that same sweet boy from the dance floor, desperately cradling their fleeting connection. Audrey had felt something special between them from the first glance. His kindness shone through, but the depth of his strength? No one had prepared her for that. When Michael proposed a simple question during a lazy Saturday morning breakfast, it held the weight of a lifetime within it. Her parents, well, of course they said yes. How could they not? Her mother fretted over his difficult past, which only made Audrey want to love him more. Dad admired his work ethic, the steady intelligence behind his eyes. To hear that gruff old man call Michael a real man, it gave her more peace than she'd imagined. They married quietly, then flew off for a honeymoon paid for by years of Michael's careful saving. No extravagance, but perfect. It was as if the weight of everything he'd been through finally began lifting, just a bit. Settling into their life together brought an ease Audrey had never experienced in a relationship before. No fights over silly things, no power struggles. Everything flowed with a harmony, as if their individual pieces were crafted to fit together all along. Their wedding felt like stepping into a sunlit meadow after years lost in the woods. The honeymoon, a splash of turquoise ocean and laughter, was a dream come true. Every brick Michael laid building their life together felt like a fortress against the loneliness of his past. Domestic life hummed with an unfamiliar rhythm, a two-part melody they were still composing. Clumsy in the kitchen, Audrey burned one dish and underseasoned the next. A quiet laugh, not a single word of complaint, met each culinary disaster. It filled her with a fierce determination to learn, a desire to nurture him the way he nurtured her. Their plans sprawled across the years like constellations, a bigger home bursting with warmth, adventures tucked into every corner of the globe, and the sweet chaos of a big family. Michael would tickle their children until they squealed with laughter, his own eyes crinkling with a joy he'd never known as a child. "A whole army of little ones," he'd tease. "First a boy, then a girl, then another boy." She'd playfully swat him, but the longing was real. Their kids, a blend of his strength and her stubborn optimism. It was the final piece of their happiness. Then, a year stretched into 2. Friends' weddings blurred into baby showers. Audrey's smile felt stiff behind the forced congratulations. The ache inside grew teeth. "We need to get checked," Michael said one night, his voice a steady anchor against the rising tide of fear. "I know it's scary, and it hurts you not to have answers. But I'm right here with you. We'll go through this together, step by step, and we won't stop until we find a path forward." That fear of doctors, white coats, words that cut deeper than scalpels, was a beast from her past. She nodded, but the dread was a stone in her stomach. His results came back perfect. That old, familiar unfairness clawed at her throat. Of course it would be her. The body broken in some way the world couldn't see. The doctor's words echoed in the hollow silence of the car ride home. "It's not a question of life or death, but natural conception. Highly unlikely. In vitro fertilization offers a slim chance, but—" The unspoken but trailed off. Tears poured. For the children they might never cradle, the echo of laughter that might never fill their home. And for him. All those childhood dreams of being needed, of building a family, ripped away by a cruel twist of fate. That night, she wept into his shoulder. It felt like a betrayal, even as his arms tightened around her. Every sob echoed against his unfairly robust health, a cruel reminder of the unfairness of it all. He stroked her hair, murmuring words of comfort she barely heard through the roaring grief. "What's all the sadness? The doctor gave us hope, IVF. If you want, we'll give it a go." Our own, Audrey murmured, tears stinging her eyes. I want a piece of us both, those big green eyes of yours in a little face. Her voice wavered. He sighed, the lines of his face etched with an unfamiliar struggle. Doesn't matter whose genes it carries. A kid's a kid, right? Each cycle of IVF became its own battlefield. Weeks of hormone injections blurring into ultrasounds, tense waits, then heartbreak. That echoed in the empty silence of their apartment. Audrey's body and spirit strained beneath the weight of it all, yet she pressed on. His unwavering support fueled her like a lifeline. Every night, the image of Michael cradling their child burned vivid in her mind. Those strong hands, suddenly gentle, laughter bouncing off the walls they filled with blueprints for a nursery. She longed to give him that piece of forever, but doubt still slithered under her skin. "No more," he finally said, the morning after another failed round. The softness in his voice didn't lessen the blow. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words refused to come. How could she deny him the family he always wanted? "Let's just live," he pleaded. "Find ourselves again in all this mess. I want you happy, not drowning." Guilt flooded her. Had her desire become a burden he carried too? But the orphanage! The hope flickered, just barely. "Think of me," he replied, a teasing glint in his eyes that couldn't quite mask the weariness. Orphan boy turned out all right. Love matters more than blood. His hand slipped back into hers, warm and sure. The decision settled between them like a stone into water, sending ripples in every direction. They embraced a fragile serenity, a truce forged in unspoken heartache. Days blurred into weeks, routines becoming a soothing balm against the chaos in their hearts. Audrey tried to fill the apartment with normalcy, the scent of a favorite meal simmering on the stove, the low murmur of Michael's beloved documentaries playing in the background. But the joy of those shared moments felt muted, strained. The lethargy that clung to him was a shadow she couldn't chase away. No longer the whirling dervish of energy, he'd retreat to the couch after dinner, dishes left half-finished. The boisterous laughter that used to fill the room now echoed only in her memory. Each unwatched episode, each abandoned project, chipped away at her dwindling optimism. The bustling city outside their window felt strangely distant. Fear took root in her stomach, twisting with every unanswered yawn, every flicker of Michael's heavy eyelids. "Maybe it's burnout," she'd offer, a forced lightness in her voice that rang hollow. All those late nights hunched over the computer. He'd nod, a ghost of his usual smile on his lips. Yet deep down, they both knew it was more than mere exhaustion. The spark behind those kind green eyes was dimming, day by agonizing day. Dread wrapped icy fingers around her heart. She coaxed him into an appointment, pretending it was a routine checkup. The drive to the clinic was shrouded in a silence so thick she could barely breathe. The doctor's words struck her like an open-handed slap. A rare autoimmune disease, a jumble of medical jargon that boiled down to one horrifying truth. His body was devouring itself from the inside out. In that sterile office, their world shattered. Their plans, their hopes, even the agonizing struggle for a child faded into insignificance against the cold threat of mortality. All that mattered was Michael, his strong shoulders now slumped in defeat, the light in his eyes flickering dangerously close to extinction. Audrey's father rallied, using his influence to get Michael under Professor James Clark's care. But even the finest physicians had limits. Hope sparked with each treatment, a brief respite, followed by the disease roaring back, twice as cruel. Michael's friends rallied round, filling the sterile ward with laughter, desperate to buoy his spirits. But there was no hiding the truth in their watery eyes when they said goodbye. Each day took a little more of him. Clothes hung loosely on his shrinking frame, that indomitable laugh now a tired rasp. A bone marrow transplant became their last, desperate gamble. But finding a match for Michael's unique blood type was like searching for a needle in a hurricane. Professor Clark didn't mince words. His chances of a match, especially on their shortening timeline, were infinitesimal. They settled into an unspoken truce, a shared acknowledgement of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Weeks turned into an aching blur. Meals once brimming with shared chatter were now silent, except for the scrape of forks on plates. Michael's infectious laugh, which used to echo through the apartment, now sounded strained and infrequent. Hope, Audrey's faithful companion for so long, began to dim. She'd coax him to the doctor, the drive an excruciating symphony of unanswered questions and thudding heartbeats. The diagnosis had arrived not with a bang, but a devastating whisper. A rare autoimmune disease. The doctor's voice faded, replaced by the relentless pounding of her own heart. The world spun. The vibrant plans she and Michael painted together, now smudged and meaningless. Even their struggle for a family once, all-consuming, seemed insignificant against the relentless march of his illness. Then, a flicker of possibility in a sterile hospital hallway. A cluster of nurses, their voices a hushed buzz behind a half-closed door. So unfortunate, one murmured. The poor wife. She's tried everything. Another voice, heavy with pity, caught Audrey's ear. He looks just like someone I knew back home. Same eyes, same strong jaw. It's uncanny. Her breath hitched. Hope, that fragile wounded bird, stirred in her chest. Every step towards them felt like crossing a battlefield. "Excuse me," her voice wavered, betraying her desperation. "My husband. You were talking about him?" The nurses startled. Confusion, then pity, washed over their faces. One, a woman with kind eyes and streaks of gray in her hair, spoke hesitantly. "We were discussing your husband's resemblance to someone. Out in Springfield. There's a man—" "Springfield?" Audrey echoed, the name unfamiliar. "Small town, mostly old-timers now," the nurse continued. "But this man, it's the damnedest thing. Could be your husband's twin." "Thompson." Thompson. Her mother-in-law's last name echoed in her skull. They couldn't be related? The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. "No way of knowing that, dear. Donor searches, that's out of our hands entirely, but you said yourself, your husband's time is running short." Time. Always against them now. Audrey's hands clenched. "This town. How far is it?" The nurses shared a map and directions, words of caution about rough roads and remote locations barely registering. A long shot, maybe even a fool's errand. Yet, as she stared at Michael's fading form in his hospital bed, clinging to consciousness by a thread, the choice was stolen from her. She had to try. So here she was, in a small town, a stranger in search of a face. Audrey, armed with boundless hope, clutched nothing more than a photograph of her husband, asking anyone if they recognized this man, this echo of Michael. The old man, after studying the photo with weathered eyes, finally nodded. "I know him," he'd said, his voice a weathered map leading her to his door. The yard was a tangle of overgrowth and litter, with a ramshackle porch barely clinging to the front of a weathered house, its paint long faded. Discarded items littered the ground, shimmering in the stray beams of sunlight. Audrey approached the creaky steps, the quiet of the seemingly abandoned home laying heavily in the air. It seemed the bell might be malfunctioning, given the audible signs of life within, the murmur of a television, the clatter of dishes. Audrey then resorted to knocking. Her initial taps were gentle, growing progressively louder with no ensuing response. Summoning her strength, Audrey rapped vigorously on the door, nearly losing her balance as the gate swung open silently. The gate, it appeared, was unlocked, inviting entry to any passer-by. Audrey stepped into a yard neglected and disordered. Audrey felt a twinge of fear, half expecting a dog to charge out or the homeowner to confront her for trespassing. Yet, the property remained eerily silent. Gathering her courage, she ascended the porch steps. The front door, surprisingly, was unlocked. However, Audrey hesitated to enter uninvited, opting to knock instead. Her knocks were forceful, yet the sound seemed muffled, as if absorbed by the old walls. Imagining the homeowner might be awaiting a guest, but certainly not her, she pushed the door open. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mustiness and decay. The room was furnished with aged pieces, their upholstery frayed and woodwork marred by cracks and splits. The house was like a time capsule from the 70s, filled with an eclectic mix of items. A doll with a face drawn in blue pen, books bloated from humidity with pages turned yellow, and an ancient cassette player were among the relics scattered about. A ficus plant awkwardly positioned in an old ice skate added to the odd assortment. Dishes cluttered every available surface: tables, window sills, and stools. Some plates were spotlessly clean, while others bore the remnants of meals past. A curious cat emerged from a pile of hay drawn by the new visitor. The kitchen buzzed with the sound of a television and a whistling kettle, while the enticing smell of frying potatoes and onions filled the air, making Audrey's mouth water in anticipation of a taste she hadn't savored in ages. "Where have you been hiding?" a voice called from the direction of the hay. Audrey tensed, unsure of what to expect in the seemingly deserted house. Yet the sight of the man before her brought a sense of relief. His features mirrored Michael's so closely: the eyes, cheekbones, forehead, and even a familiar mole on the neck, though the resemblance wasn't perfect. Unlike Michael, who lived healthily, this man's lifestyle had clearly taken a toll on him. Michael always appeared healthy and well-groomed, his skin clear and his hair thick, his athletic build complemented by his stylish attire. In stark contrast stood the man before Audrey, his lifestyle of heavy smoking and drinking etched into his appearance with reddened eyes, pronounced wrinkles, and a neglected beard. Yet his attire, though worn and mismatched, seemed to fit the ruggedness of his look. "Who might you be?" the homeowner inquired, his tone devoid of any hostility, merely curious. "I'm not even sure where to begin," Audrey confessed, suggesting he first examine her husband's photograph. As the man leaned in, the resemblance to Michael became even more uncanny. After a glance, he asked, "And? He's a handsome fellow, but he's a stranger to me." "Don't you see any resemblance?" Audrey pressed, seeking clarity without subtlety. "I prefer directness. I'm not one for beating around the bush," he admitted. Observing her hesitation, he invited her to join him for a meal, treating her with the familiarity of a neighbor or a long-time acquaintance. This casual hospitality eased Audrey's initial discomfort. Despite his rough exterior and the signs of a hard life, the man's sympathetic demeanor drew Audrey in. Seated on an uncluttered stool, she began to unravel her story, her initial confusion giving way to a detailed account that captivated her listener. He absorbed every detail, maintaining a composed exterior, yet Audrey sensed the impact of her narrative. As she recounted her husband's illness and the snippets of conversation caught from nurses, she painted a picture of Michael's life that seemed to resonate deeply with the man. "Seeing you now, it's as if no DNA test is needed. You're the spitting image of my husband," she remarked, prompting him to re-examine the photos. His hands trembled slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. "Could it be? Is your husband actually my brother?" he pondered aloud, his voice tinged with a mix of hope and disbelief. "Did you ever have a brother?" Audrey asked, her voice laden with hope for a connection that might offer salvation from Michael's illness. Introducing himself as David, he noted the rarity of Audrey's name, setting aside formalities as they delved deeper into the possibility of an unforeseen familial bond. "Yes, I had a brother," David confirmed with a nod. "Let me share a story with you, and we can piece things together afterward. It's no coincidence you're here." David found himself the de facto man of the house at just 8 years old, a role frequently highlighted by his many sisters. They leaned on him for chores, from manly house tasks to cooking meals, tasks he took on from a tender age. In their crowded home, the presence of father figures was fleeting and inconsistent. None took the responsibility to nurture or support the children genuinely. Their mother, entangled in her own life and romances, seemed to lose track of the children she bore. Her lifestyle, marked by frequent socializing with a friend, Margaret Thompson, eventually took its toll. The family's living conditions were modest at best, with makeshift sleeping arrangements scattered throughout their cramped home, ranging from dilapidated beds to mattresses laid on the floor, or even just a fur coat in a corner for warmth. They eked out an existence on the meager social welfare provided by the state, barely managing to get by. Occasionally, the charity of Margaret's acquaintances provided some relief, offering food essentials like potatoes, meat, and milk to the children. Life in their humble dwelling was a daily struggle, marked by poverty and neglect. The children wore patched clothes to school, endured the biting cold of winter without proper heating, and holidays passed without the slightest treat. While many families faced hardships, they endeavored to care for their children. Margaret, however, seemed detached from the grim realities of their situation, living as if in her own carefree world, treating her children more like distant acquaintances than her own flesh and blood. Her rare interactions were devoid of warmth or concern, leaving the children to fend for themselves against any adversity. David, bearing the brunt of this neglect, found his home life increasingly intolerable. The constant influx of his mother's guests, coupled with the harsh demands of his elder sisters, weighed heavily on him. Inspired by their mother's example, the sisters seemed destined to tread the same path, bringing their own chaotic lives and new families into the already overcrowded home. Feeling trapped and desperate, David recalled his childhood thoughts of escape to a simpler, peaceful life in the woods, away from the turmoil. Yet, the thought of leaving his younger sibling Lily held him back. The situation grew more complicated when it was revealed that their mother was expecting yet another child. The news was met not with joy, but with practical concerns about space and resources, highlighting the stark reality of their living conditions. Margaret's casual approach to her pregnancies only added to the sense of impending difficulty as the family braced for the addition of another member to their strained household. "I won't bring the baby home from the hospital. I'll just sign the papers to give him up," Margaret declared. At that moment, David nearly choked on his bread in shock. "How can you just give up a baby like that?" he wondered aloud. Having helped care for Lily, David knew too well how vulnerable and needy infants were. The thought of abandoning a baby, leaving it all alone, was unimaginable to him. "Please, Mom, let's keep the baby. I'll help take care of him," David pleaded, only to be met with laughter from the adults at the table. "You still don't get it, do you?" mocked one of David's older sisters as she playfully threw a pillowcase over the boy's head. Distraught, David retreated to the yard, secretly hoping this new sibling would be a brother. He longed for the companionship of a brother, someone to share in boyish adventures, and to whom he could teach everything he knew. David felt a deep loneliness despite the crowded house, and believed that having a brother would change everything. He pleaded with his mother every day not to abandon the newborn at the hospital. Margaret's response varied with her mood, sometimes light-hearted, other times annoyed by David's persistence. David struggled to express the depth of his longing for a brother, a concept so vital to his hopes and dreams. Reflecting back, David couldn't fathom how he had sensed that the baby would be a boy, attributing it perhaps to a deep-seated desire. The night Margaret went into labor was chaotic, with the onset of contractions catching everyone by surprise during a lively party. As the situation escalated, a guest called for an ambulance, which seemed to take an eternity to arrive. Amidst the anxiety and confusion, some even braced to deliver the baby themselves, underlining the gravity of the moment. Thankfully, the ambulance arrived just in time, and Margaret was rushed to the maternity hospital. David couldn't forget the look of judgment from the paramedic, questioning Margaret's state and her drinking habits. Margaret's defense was that it made her harsh life more bearable, dismissing concerns about the baby's well-being with a wave of her hand, claiming all her children turned out fine despite her lifestyle. When Margaret was taken away, David was filled with dread, fearing she might abandon the new baby, the brother he had longed for. He kept asking his older sister Emily if their mother would really leave the baby behind, but even Emily seemed resigned to the possibility, suggesting it might be for the best given their circumstances. Upon Margaret's return, empty-handed and eager to celebrate her freedom from the hospital, David's heart sank. Confronting his mother, he demanded to know where his brother was, only to be shocked by her claim that it had been a girl who died shortly after birth. David revealed to Audrey that he later discovered the truth when overhearing a conversation between his mother and Aunt Susan. Susan questioned Margaret's decision to leave the baby at the hospital, hinting that the boy could have been a great support to the family, especially to David, who had dreamt of having a brother. Overhearing this, David realized the painful truth that he indeed had a brother, now likely lost to an orphanage or adopted by strangers, never knowing of the brother who had so eagerly awaited his arrival. This realization marked a profound moment of loss and helplessness for David, underscoring the neglect and indifference that pervaded his childhood. As the years passed, the situation at home worsened, with Margaret's health declining due to her drinking and the sisters gradually leaving the tumultuous household. As time passed, David became the eldest child at home, with his youngest sister Lily being only 7. Lily was different. She struggled with speech and often didn't grasp what was said to her. Despite the taunts from other children, her response was always a smile, embodying pure innocence and love for everyone around her. David had a deep bond with Lily, having cared for her since she was a baby. Her simple gestures of affection made him feel invincible and deeply loved. He was her protector, always vigilant, especially because Lily was unaware of the dangers around her. The villagers blamed Margaret's drinking during pregnancy for Lily's condition, which made David wonder if things could have been different for his sister under better circumstances. To keep Lily safe, David was cautious, creating a play area near the house with a tire swing and sandbox, avoiding the playground to shield her from unkind peers. Though the other siblings cared for Lily in their own ways, none matched David's dedication. On a fateful evening, David had to step out to buy groceries, leaving Lily playing in the yard, confident that their mother, typically away with the Wilsons, wouldn't be back until late. But that night, Margaret returned unexpectedly early due to a dispute. In her drunken state, she neglected to close the gate behind her, leaving Lily vulnerable. Margaret greeted David as he returned. "I've brought some bread," he slurred, a hint of pride in his voice. "Well done, my boy. Now, Mother can have her fill." "Where's Lily?" David inquired, concern edging his voice. Margaret nonchalantly gestured towards the sandbox outside the window, her disdain for Lily barely concealed. Unlike her general neglect for her children, Margaret harbored a specific animosity towards Lily, often provoked by the mere sight of her. "She's not there!" Panic surged through David as he yelled, dashing outside in hopes of finding Lily nearby. It was unlike her to wander off by herself. David usually made sure to be by Lily's side, especially since Sophia, the oldest sister still living at home, insisted that Lily needed constant supervision due to her unpredictable nature and vulnerability. When David's distress caught the attention of Florence, their neighbor, the gravity of the situation quickly unfolded. Moved by the urgency, she rallied the community, turning the search for Lily into a collective effort. As hours turned into a day without any sign of Lily, the grim reality set in, prompting a call to the authorities. The search intensified, but hope waned among the volunteers, with whispers that finding Lily alive might be a diminishing possibility. David was tormented by guilt, regretting his decision to leave Lily even for a short while to run errands. He hadn't anticipated his mother's early return, a miscalculation that now seemed to carry the heaviest of consequences. The breakthrough came when divers discovered Lily near the lake, a place David often took her to enjoy the simple pleasures of water and sand. It seemed that in her moment of unsupervised freedom, Lily had been drawn to the lake, a familiar spot where she had experienced joy and comfort. David had always been vigilant during these outings, ensuring Lily stayed safe and within his sight, never venturing too far into the water. The realization of where she was found underscored the depth of David's care and the tragic turn of events that led to her disappearance. The tragedy haunted David for years, the vivid memories of that day etched in his mind. The police's arrival at their home, the grim procession to the lake, and the heart-wrenching sight that awaited them there left an indelible mark on his soul. In the wake of the tragedy, the family came under scrutiny for their living conditions and Margaret's neglect, with authorities considering intervention. But amidst the chaos, David was consumed by grief and self-reproach, believing he could have prevented the tragedy had he been there. Margaret's reaction, devoid of maternal grief and almost relieved at Lily's absence, shocked David to his core. Her callous words about Lily being a burden were a stark revelation of her indifference, driving a deeper wedge of resentment and sorrow in David's heart. David chose to remain silent in the face of his mother's indifference, recognizing the futility of seeking empathy from her. The intervention by authorities culminated in Margaret being stripped of her parental rights, leading to the children's placement in orphanages. David and his sister Sophia found themselves in one facility, while their other siblings were sent elsewhere, soon to be adopted by a family that promised a brighter future in a new city. Despite the separation, David held on to the hope that his sisters would find happiness and safety in their new lives. For David, the orphanage represented a stark, yet welcome contrast to his previous tumultuous life. The simple comforts of a clean bed, regular meals, and the absence of endless chores and late-night disturbances brought a sense of peace and normalcy he had never known. The orphanage offered David what his home could not, an environment conducive to childhood and learning. For the first time, he had the chance to engage with his studies, particularly drawn to the sciences, which he had scarcely had the opportunity to explore amidst the chaos of his family life. Sophia, however, struggled with the structured environment of the orphanage, yearning for the unrestrained freedom she once knew, despite its accompanying hardships. She voiced her frustrations about the regimented schedule, longing for the day she could reclaim her independence. As time moved on, David and Sophia eventually aged out of the orphanage system, stepping into the next chapter of their lives with the experiences of their past, shaping their outlook and aspirations. By the time David and his siblings returned to their ancestral home, their mother had passed away, leaving behind a dilapidated and neglected house as the setting for their new beginnings. David earnestly attempted to forge a new path for himself, yet the lack of formal education and job opportunities in the village hindered his progress. He resorted to odd jobs, often receiving payment in vodka, which gradually led him down a path of dependency as a means to escape his sorrows and the haunting memories of his family. David, reflecting on his past with a heavy heart, acknowledged the brief respite that alcohol provided from the burdens of his losses and the turmoil that had pervaded his life. Audrey, empathetic to his struggles, recognized the depth of the adversity he had faced. In the midst of their conversation, the sudden sound of youthful energy broke the somber mood, as Hope, an 8-year-old girl embodying the innocence and charm that could rival that of any child, burst into the room. Her resemblance to Michael was striking, making her seem almost like his own child despite her mismatched and worn attire. Her vibrant green eyes and unkempt hair only added to her endearing appearance. Hope's entrance brought a momentary lightness to the heavy atmosphere. Her affectionate embrace of David and curious introduction to Audrey, showcasing the simple, unfiltered world of a child. David gently directed her to continue playing, promising a proper introduction to Audrey later, allowing a brief respite from the weight of the past discussions. Hope, still glancing at Audrey, agreed to continue their conversation later. "I'm off to Wilson's then. Sarah got new dolls. We're gonna play," she said with youthful enthusiasm. "Sure, go ahead," David responded with a nod. As Hope hurried out, Audrey, struck by the girl's resemblance to David, asked, "Is she your daughter? She's very beautiful, and you two look alike." "No, she's my niece," David explained with a gentle smile. "Sophia's kid." "Sophia? Well, she's followed in our mother's footsteps. Had hope but didn't stick around to raise her. Last I heard, she's off trying to make some money. Found a new guy in the city. She's out drinking, partying, not giving a second thought to her daughter. So here I am, doing what I can for Hope." Audrey, puzzled by this revelation, pressed further. "How can someone just abandon their own child?" David sighed. "It's sadly easy for some. Sophia's just like Mom was. Doesn't see the need for hope. As long as the child support checks keep coming, she's content. Anyway, you were saying about your husband's brother?" Audrey nodded, taking a moment before diving into her story. "I've always hoped to find him. Never really believed I would, though. And now—" She trailed off, ready to share the journey that led her to David's doorstep. Talking about her husband Michael was a joy for Audrey. Her affection and pride for him were evident. David listened intently, genuinely curious about Michael's interests, work, and aspirations. "When can I meet him?" David asked, eager to help. "Could be as soon as tomorrow. Are you willing to undergo the test and possibly donate, if needed?" "Of course," David responded, without hesitation. "I'm all in." Audrey was moved to the verge of tears by his willingness to help. Despite his modest circumstances, David's kindness and empathy shone through, deeply touching her. "What time should I be there tomorrow, and where?" he inquired, ready to see his potential brother. Audrey provided the hospital's address, suggesting they meet at the main entrance. "I'll let the doctors know we're coming, so they'll be prepared." The next morning, Audrey easily spotted David near the designated meeting spot, his presence a reassuring sight amidst her anxiety and hope. Audrey's heart skipped a beat, her mind clouded with worries that David might reconsider or, worse, be incapacitated from the previous night's indulgences. But her fears were unfounded. David was there, ahead of time, visibly anxious yet determined, his efforts to present himself well evident despite his worn attire. She led him to the lab first, where the medical team was prepped for the complex procedure. Afterward, David expressed a desire to meet Michael, his use of brother imbued with a warmth and anticipation that moved Audrey. "You can meet him, but just so you know, I haven't mentioned anything to him yet. Be ready for his surprise," Audrey cautioned. Michael was having a better morning, buoyed by new treatments that lent him a semblance of vitality. His face lit up with a broad smile at Audrey's unexpected early visit. "Hey there," he greeted her. "You're here early today. Wasn't expecting you just yet." "I've got news for you, big news, and I'm not sure how to even start," Audrey told Michael, her heart racing with anticipation. After sharing the initial details, Audrey found herself sitting in the corridor outside Michael's room, giving space to the newly reunited brothers. The resemblance between Michael and David was unmistakable, confirming their kinship beyond any doubt. Inside, the brothers engaged in earnest conversation, embarking on the journey of bridging the years and experiences they had missed out on together. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction seeing Michael connect with David, something he had longed for, yet feared. David, despite his turbulent past and hardships, exuded kindness and warmth, qualities that Audrey believed would enrich Michael's life. Audrey's thoughts were consumed by the hope that David would be a match as a donor for Michael. The wait for the test results, stretching over 3 agonizing days, seemed interminable. She tried to distract herself, but the possibility of David not being a match loomed over her, casting a shadow on Michael's prospects. David had offered a backup plan, suggesting he could persuade their sister Sophia to consider testing. But Audrey intuitively felt that relying on Sophia was a long shot. The uncertainty of Sophia's willingness, combined with the ticking clock, added layers of anxiety to an already tense wait. When Professor James confirmed David as a perfect match for Michael, Audrey's relief and joy were uncontainable. The news that her husband was ready for the operation marked the beginning of a hopeful yet challenging journey. The ensuing 2 years were a testament to resilience and the strength of familial bonds. Michael's operation and the lengthy recovery process that followed were daunting, but the support from Audrey, her family, and newfound kinship with David and Hope brought solace and strength. David's visits, often accompanied by the lively Hope, became a source of joy for both Audrey and Michael, enriching their lives with the warmth of extended family ties. Michael's eventual recovery and return to his routine, infused with renewed vigor, was a victory over the trials they had faced. In a gesture of brotherly concern and love, Michael insisted on David seeking help for his alcohol dependency, offering a chance at a new beginning. Despite David's initial resistance, rooted in a resignation to his lifelong struggle with addiction, the prospect of change, supported by the care and insistence of his brother, hinted at a new chapter for him, one filled with hope and the possibility of transformation. David's concern for Hope's well-being while he sought treatment was met with a compassionate response from Michael and Audrey, who welcomed Hope into their home. For Audrey, this was an opportunity to embrace the maternal role she had longed for, enriching Hope's life with care, affection, and the joys of childhood. Michael, too, found delight in his interactions with Hope, engaging in playful and educational activities, fostering a bond that felt increasingly like that of a true family. The turning point came during a visit to the rehabilitation center. In a moment of vulnerability, David, with a mix of humility and hope, proposed that Michael and Audrey officially take Hope under their wing. His acknowledgement of his own limitations and recognition of the loving environment Michael and Audrey provided for Hope laid the foundation for a significant decision. Moved by David's request and their own deep affection for Hope, Michael and Audrey embraced the idea of becoming Hope's legal guardians. The prospect of parting with Hope had already seemed unbearable to them, and David's suggestion only affirmed their desire to ensure Hope remained a permanent part of their lives. The legal process to formalize their guardianship, though challenging, was a battle they were willing to fight. Sophia's indifference to her daughter's fate and absence from the crucial court proceedings only solidified the court's decision to terminate her parental rights, a decision she received with apparent disinterest. David's reflections on Sophia's character painted a picture of a woman ensnared in the same patterns of negligence that had marred their own childhoods. Meanwhile, David's time in rehabilitation marked a period of personal growth and recovery, offering a glimmer of hope for his future. David's life took a positive turn as he successfully overcame his addiction, largely due to the unwavering support of Michael and Audrey. His gratitude was often expressed in moments of heartfelt, albeit awkward, appreciation. "You've done so much for me," he would say, reflecting on the transformative impact they had on his life. Michael, humble in his response, would often credit Audrey for her role in reuniting the brothers, emphasizing the collective effort in changing their lives for the better. Recognizing David's aptitude and potential, Michael facilitated his employment at the same company where he worked, a decision that proved beneficial for all involved. David's skill set made him a valuable asset to the technical department, and Michael encouraged him to move closer to them in the city, advocating for the strength found in familial proximity. Heeding his brother's advice, David sold their old village home, dividing the proceeds between Sophia, in fairness, and a down payment for a new beginning in the city. He secured a modest apartment near Michael's, an arrangement that delighted Hope, who cherished the bond she shared with her uncle. The close-knit family frequently gathered, sharing everyday moments and celebrating holidays together, creating a warm, inclusive atmosphere that extended beyond blood relations. For Audrey, witnessing the bond between David and Michael was a source of joy and a slight pang of envy for the sibling connection she never had. Yet, in the shared experiences and mutual support of this extended family, she found a sense of belonging and fulfillment that transcended her childhood dreams.